Perry Hendricks, welcome to the Uncertainty Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Miles. Although, since you're not in the U.S., should I be saying kilometer?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. I haven't heard that joke since I was in 10th grade, but thanks. So I wanted to discuss the problem of evil with you and the so-called skeptical theistic response to that problem. So, since you're the guest, to make you do the heavy lifting, what's the problem of evil? Why is it a problem?
So there's a lot of different versions of the problem of evil, but we can just think about bad things, like things one example would be like things that are painful. So I'm looking at you right now, and you got more jewelry than an elderly Southern woman, and I imagine that having those holes poked in you would cause some amount of pain. And you might think, if God exists, why are there painful things? Why are there bad things? Or you might think of look, there's these cases where animals die in forest fires and they undergo excruciating pain. We look around and we don't recognize any reason that could justify God in allowing that. So you might think probably there is no reason that would justify God in allowing that. And if you hold that God would only allow evil if there is this sort of justifying reason, then you have some evidence for why God doesn't exist. So the problem of evil in one general sense is sort of making sense of why there's suffering in the world if God exists, or why there are bad things in the world if God exists, and we don't recognize reasons why they're there.
So that would be the version of I think this is right. The main version of the problem of evil that most people, non-philosophers, come up with anyway, is this issue of so-called gratuitous evil. Evil that there doesn't seem to be any morally justifying reason for. But there are other versions of the problem of evil that are more nuanced than that, or that take things in a different direction. But I think that's right, that version of the problem, like we see this instance of evil, I can't come up with any reason that would justify God in permitting it, and so there probably is no reason. That seems to be like the layman's problem of evil and the most common form of it, right?
Yeah, I hesitate to call it the layman's because it's also William Rowe's version, who was not a layman.
It's both, right?
Yeah. And it's I don't think it's a very strong argument. I think the most plausible versions of the argument from evil are going to be Paul Draper's and Michael Tooley's. But it's a good the way that skeptical theism originated, in its contemporary form, is as a response to this kind of argument from evil. I think it has applications to the other arguments, but that's kind of a good stepping stone to introducing that. So I guess it's okay. Unless you had something else you were going to say there.
Nope, just that that seems right. That the problem of evil here that we're dealing with is that there are facts related to evil which seem very unlikely if God exists, and given that they are facts, that's significant evidence that God doesn't exist. That's a rough and ready way of putting it, but that seems to be the nutshell idea.
Yeah, and so I think Rowe published his original essay in 1974, and then there's a lot of back and forth on that, at least through the early 2000s. But new arguments have emerged, like Paul Draper's and Michael Tooley's. But okay, so how did skeptical theists respond to Rowe's argument? Well, they say, okay, let's grant that. And to be clear, there are lots of different kinds of skeptical theism. I'm just going to focus on one right now. But so we have this claim that there's some instance of evil or badness or suffering. We recognize no reason why God, if he exists, would allow that. So probably there is no such reason. The skeptical theist of all sorts is going to reject this inference from we recognize no reason why God would allow it to the conclusion that therefore there probably is no reason for God to allow it. And the reasons for rejecting it are going to be different depending on the kind of skeptical theism that's on offer. So the kind that I would advocate, or that I do, I guess, would be something very much like Michael Bergman's. So in this case, I'm just going to simplify it and take out a few bells and whistles that I've added to it, but to make it easier to digest. But the basic thought would be we have no good reason to think that the perceived weight of God's reasons resembles the actual weight of his reasons for allowing some instance of evil. But if that's true, then we have no reason, even if given the reasons we perceive that God has for preventing some instance of horrific evil weighs on the side of impermissible, then we can't infer that it's probably impermissible, because we have no reason to think that that sort of judgment about the weight of God's reasons resembles how things actually are. Does that make sense?
Yes. The example that I like is that the skeptical theist will claim that for all we know, the evils and the reasons connected to them that we can perceive are kind of akin to a sample size that only includes chihuahuas, and then trying to infer the height and weight of most dogs. Well, chihuahuas aren't representative of most dogs with respect to height and weight, and therefore any inductive inference from them to the whole class of dogs is unjustified. But the point would be more subtle, that the skeptical theist says we can't know if evils are like the chihuahua or not. And so just from that point alone, we can't justifiably infer anything about the whole class of evils and reasons connected to them.
Yeah, I don't like
kind of right.
I don't like the "for all we know" language. I've got an article explaining exactly why I don't like that.
Right.
I would stick to more like, we have no good reason to think that this that I'll put it this way. So we have no good reason to think that our sample, or in this case, it's not exactly a sample. Like, we have the reasons we think of why God could permit some instance of evil, and we have the reasons why God couldn't permit it. And we have no reason to think that that perception isn't accurately represents how things actually are. So you might think of it this way: like, if a scientist does a study and finds that her drug cures cancer among this group of patients, and if she says, so it probably cures cancer among all patients. But then you ask, okay, well, why should we think that this is true? Why should we think that what you're saying applies to all cancer patients and not just your sample? And she just cannot give you a single good reason for thinking that. She just is unable to offer one. Well, in that case, you should be skeptical about it. It's not that not having the good reason just necessarily results in the skepticism. It's once you realize that there's no good reason, and you come to see that, you should be in doubt about whether this sort of sample is representative of the whole, or you should be in doubt about whether the perceived weight of God's reasons represents the actual weight of his reasons. And once you're in doubt there, you get this defeater, and you shouldn't give any weight to the inference that's being used.
So that brings a question to mind. Do you think that evil is any evidence against God's existence, or just that it's weak evidence? Because what occurred to me when hearing that example is that arguably the success of the doctor in curing her patients, even without that reason for thinking that her patients are representative of the broader group of cancer patients, it's still some evidence, even if weak, that other cancer patients could benefit from this treatment. And so that makes me think, okay, so we survey all the justifying reasons we can think of. None of them are adequate to morally justify God in permitting these evils. So that's some reason, however weak, to think that God doesn't have any reasons, that there are no such reasons. Or should we say that there's just no evidential significance at all to our perceptions of reasons, blah, blah, blah?
So I wobble between thinking that it's trivial evidence and that it's no evidence, but I'd favor that it's
okay.
No.
And why is that? I mean, given the example you gave of the cancer patient and the doctor, that seems to suggest weak. I don't know what you mean by trivial, though.
Like, maybe, trivial. So if I have evidence, if I have some, what I mean by that is, like, if it increases the probability by 0.000000001, that's trivial evidence.
Sure.
But I mean, I think that once you come to see that there's no reason to think that the sample of patients resembles or once you come to see that you have no reason to think that the drug will be effective on all patients, I don't know, it doesn't look like any reason at all. It doesn't provide evidence at all for thinking that it's going to cure all patients. But that's controversial. So sure. Yeah, I do wobble between thinking it might be trivial evidence or no evidence. But yeah, like, I favor that's no evidence. I don't think once you find that out, then you should think that it increases the probability at all.
Right. Okay. So that's the skeptical theistic response to the problem of evil, is to say that we've really got no reason at all for making that jump from our perceptions of possible reasons to the reality of all possible reasons. So that it's, for all we know, well, I know we don't like those locutions, but plug in whatever you'd like. But for all we know, God has a reason for permitting these evils that we just don't know about. And so that undercuts the argument against God's existence, just neutralizes the evidential force of evil.
Yeah, so it'd be like, so in order to say, you might say you can't ascribe a probability to that evil given theism, and if that's true, it's just not going to be evidence at all. Because you have to have the probability of the evil given theism and also the probability of the evil given the falsity of theism. Yeah, I guess when I think about it that way, I'd say, yeah, there's no evidence, then I'm comfortable with that.
Not everybody is convinced by the skeptical theistic gambit. Why is that? What are the leading issues that non-theistic philosophers who press the problem of evil will raise against skeptical theism? I mean, I have some of them here, but I figure I'll ask you what you take to be the leading issues with it.
Well, clearly some kind of mental malfunction, some kind of cognitive malfunction is at play. That's why they but no, I think that there are 2 or 3 serious objections to skeptical theism. One of them is going to be Hudson's excessive skeptical argument, where he argues that if skeptical theism is true, so he says, like, think about like an instance of divine testimony. If God tells you something, if skeptical theism is right, it looks like you can't really say, you can't give any reason to think it's probable that God's telling the truth here, he's not deceiving you. And if that's true, then given the non-reductionist view, or given the reductionist view of testimonial knowledge, where you have to have positive reason to trust a testifier with respect to this instance of testimony, it looks like skeptical theism is incompatible with acquiring knowledge based on divine revelation or having justified belief based on divine revelation, depending on which model you're going with. And he thinks that bleeds out elsewhere. I think that's the best and probably only plausible skeptical objection to skeptical theism. And then Nevin Climenhaga has an objection. I probably can't spell the details on that off the top of my head right now, but he has a very, so it is 3. Nevin's objection is very good. And then the third one, which I think is probably the most serious objection to skeptical theism, is an equiprobability objection to skeptical theism. So this has been defended by Paul Draper and Richard Swinburne, and they'll say something very roughly like, it's true that we don't know the probability that there's some unknown good attached to some instance of evil that would sort of outweigh it. But equally true is we also have no good reason to think there's no unknown evil that's equally strong as the unknown good attached to this evil that would sort of balance off that unknown good if it were there. And if that's the case, then even if there are these unknown goods, equally true, there's also these unknown evils, and they're equiprobable. And due to some technical reasons, it's going to result that the probability of this evil being justified remains as it was before skeptical theism. So I think those are the 3 best objections to skeptical theism. Do you want me to go into why I reject them, or do you want to do something different?
Yeah, so that first objection, and we'll see how far we can go, is the issue of, like, I take it's a version of the issue of divine deception. Once we say that for any of these horrific instances of evil that we observe, whether it's just run-of-the-mill evils like car crashes that we witness, or all the way to things like the Holocaust, if we look at those and we can't know one way or another whether or not God would permit it, then it seems equally the case that we can't know whether God would deceive us, that maybe God has a morally sufficient reason for lying to us. And then you wonder, okay, well, if that's the case in general, well, then how do I trust any claims of divine revelation at all? Like biblical promises that if I trust in Jesus Christ, I'll receive eternal life. Well, if skeptical theism is true, does that remove our warrant for perhaps we can know God said this, but maybe God's lying? How are we to say? And if you say, well, lying is morally evil, God wouldn't do it. Well, then that kind of response will just bite you in the butt for every other evil that we actually observe. This is evil, God wouldn't do it. That's not exactly Hudson's objection, but it's probably the broader objection that it's.
How do we know God wouldn't lie? Skeptical theists can't cite all sorts of reasons for thinking he wouldn't lie, and so they can't give this positive reason. So the reason I don't think that works is because reductionism about testimonial knowledge is false, and that's what it's based on. So the reductionist says, in addition to having the positive, this good quality testimony, you have to have positive reason for trusting the testifier in that case. Otherwise, you don't know it, and you don't justifiably believe it. The non-reductionist thinks of testimony as this basic source of knowledge that you can acquire knowledge off just by hearing good quality testimony and accurately discerning it. And if that's right, then this doesn't really matter. If God gives this instance, if God reveals himself or says something in some way, and you don't have a defeater for it, and it's good quality testimony, you're going to at least possibly know it and possibly have a justified belief about it. So my fundamental dispute with Hudson there is that he assumes reductionism, which I just think is false. But it's definitely a problem for the reductionist about testimony.
Okay, so the general idea then is that skeptical theism only potentially removes any reasons we have for thinking God's testimony to us is true. It doesn't actually provide a reason to think that it's false. And so long as it doesn't do that, then if we reject this reductionism, we can still potentially know the things that God is saying are true.
Yeah, so skeptical theism prevents us from acquiring the positive reasons for trusting God. But it turns out if non-reductionism is true, we don't need the positive reasons anyway. And so it doesn't
okay.
eliminate knowledge or justification.
But don't you think it still weakens trust in God? I mean, if I return it to a human example, I trust my mom when she tells me that she loves me or she cares about me, or that there's an accident on I-40 and I should take a different route to get to grandma's. Because of my past experience with her, and she's been honest in the past and my knowledge of her character, blah, 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 blah. If you remove all those things, okay, maybe there is still some basis for trust as just the default, but it's now much weaker. And I don't know, I don't like the idea that all I've got for thinking my, for example, eternal destiny will work out the way that it does is just kind of this default trust that God's not lying to me. Like, I would like to think there's a necessary moral connection between God and not lying about something like that. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there could be. You could find, you could think about, you might think like something like Mark Murphy's view, where it would be really unfitting. It would be unfitting of God to be a kind of imperfection of him to lie. So maybe you can go that route. I'm not sure if that's true, but there might be some other ways you could get this positive reason. But I also don't think that it's not going to weaken your trust. You either have this trust or you don't. And then if you acquire positive reasons, it could increase your trust in your mom. But if you don't have them, it's not going to weaken it. It's just going to leave it at the baseline. And maybe you had a high degree of trust to begin with. Maybe that's the way we're designed, is to trust our parents. In fact, very probably it is. And the fact is, like kids don't recognize these kinds of reasons for trusting their parents and trusting people. They just sort of have these biases towards trust and not having the positive reasons. Yeah, so I guess the general thought here is that not having a positive reason shouldn't necessarily reduce your trust in God or in another person, but it does prevent you from raising the degree of trust. But you already might have this high degree of trust or something like that.
Okay. So that's the first one. The second one is Nevin Climenhaga's objection, which is a little abstract, but I need to come up with an alternative phrase to this one, but for the time being, the in a nutshell version of that objection is that in a probabilistic framework, in a mathematical framework for relating evidence to hypotheses, where theism in this case is a hypothesis and our evidence is evil. If we utilize Bayes' theorem as that framework, it will follow, and you can just take my word for it, that if we say that evil is no evidence whatsoever against God's existence because we can't give a precise likelihood of evil given theism. Like, let's say for some phenomenon, we said that, well, if God exists, if theism is true, it's 50% likely that that thing would result. What if we can't make any probability ascriptions like that, where it seems like skeptical theism says, with respect to evil, that the best we can do is represent evil given theism as the range 0 to 1, where 0 is 0%, 1 is 100%. So we can't say anything more precise than that. It just spans the whole range. Well, if that's the right interpretation of skeptical theism, then Nevin argues quite convincingly that once you then step back and try to assess how likely theism is given all of our evidence, we have to take evil into account. We can't just section it off. But once you do that, then no matter what else you include in your total evidence, like fine-tuning or moral experience or scientific evidence for a beginning of the universe, the fact that evil consists in the range 0 to 1 will mean that the final probability of theism could only ever be a range of 0 to some number less than or equal to 1, which would prevent you from saying that the probability of theism is greater than 50%. Now, that's a very technical objection, and unless you know about Bayes' theorem, it probably didn't make any sense. Still, Perry, what is your response to that?
So my response, and yeah, I think that objection is good, is that I want to restrict the scope of skeptical theism to our public reasons and our antecedent reasons. And by public reasons, I mean reasons that basically aren't your own mental states. They aren't your own intuitions or beliefs. They're things that we have equal access to in general, like you and I have equal access to the population of the United States right now. We can both look it up or something like that. Or we have equal access to how big the house I'm in is right now. There's an in principle way that you and I can both assess that or come to find that out. And then by antecedent, I mean to just sort of set aside our beliefs about God and whether God exists, because that can influence how we think about the probabilities here. Because if we think God exists, and if we think that God wouldn't allow evil that there's no justifying reason for, then even if we run into this evil for which we recognize no justifying reason for God to allow it, the probability that there is this reason is going to be 1 because God exists. So I want to restrict the scope of skeptical theism to public and antecedent reasons. And then, so it might be that the probability of evil is inscrutable given that, but that it's not inscrutable when we take into account these other facts or these other beliefs we have. And so my thought is he's right if we stay at that level, but the skeptical theism I'm defending, which I take to be roughly tantamount to Mike Bergman's skeptical theism, just with a few bells and whistles, is going to say that this isn't the case, all things considered, that the probability of evil given theism is inscrutable. That's in a gist what I say.
Okay, so then that's a good segue into your specific version of skeptical theism, which is that on one version of it, so-called axiological skeptical theism, that we have no good public antecedent reason for thinking that the actual value of a state of affairs resembles its perceived value. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd reverse those, but that amounts to the same thing. Yeah, we have no good reason
Okay.
that the perceived value of some state of affairs resembles the actual value.
Okay,
Also,
good.
When people say just, or what is it, so-called, it's usually a negative thing. So I'm going to assume that you don't like my views here. The so-called.
No, it's just a mouthful. So I have to poke fun at us philosophers for our complicated and highfalutin terminology. I also, but in truth, I do worry about the significance of this very qualified version of skeptical theism. It's limited to public reasons. I take it that antecedent is fine. It just clarifies what's usually in the background. But so a public reason is, like you said, roughly a reason that is in principle accessible to everyone. And it contrasts with private reasons, which I take it are the reasons we would give for thinking that there are these ordinary objects in the external world. Like my reason for thinking that there's a red mug in front of me is that it seems to me that there's a red mug. It literally presents to my consciousness in a certain way. And that's a private reason. That specific reason, as I frame it, is private because no one can get inside my consciousness and see that seeming. But they can then look at the mug themselves. So the distinction is a bit murky to me. Perhaps maybe you could say a bit more about what that distinction consists
that's
in.
going to be controversial. Like a direct realist is going to think you really see the mug. It's not based on this sort of
right,
something like that. So that's going to be a controversial example. But definitely, the majority of philosophers hold this indirect approach that you were saying there. But yeah, I mean, the way that I understand typical arguments from evil are supposed.
Okay, we're good.
Oh, I lost. The way that I understand these typical arguments from evil they're supposed to be appealing to public reasons. They're supposed to convince people who don't necessarily have the same beliefs and so on. So I think that the typical arguments from evil are supposed to be targeting are based on our public reasons. So I think skeptical theism still has this reach there. I also have a chapter in a book I wrote on these what I call common sense problems of evil that do appeal to mental states, and I do think that the mental states approach is going to be subject to defeaters in the end as well. But at this stage, I guess my thought is that most the arguments from evil, aside from the common sense ones, are supposed to be running off of public reasons, and so I think it's still significant in that respect.
Okay, so here is something I wrote out as an expression of my worry. I said I worry that this thesis is so weak that it's insignificant, because one could speak about external world skepticism, and here I'm making it a parallel to axiological skepticism, and define it as the view that for any sensory experience S, we have no good public antecedent reason to think it's likely that S's perceived characteristics resembles its actual characteristics. And I think we should accept this version of external world skepticism, but that's because no one thinks we have public reasons for affirming our common sense beliefs about the external world, aside from direct realists, I take it. Belief in a mind-independent world is probably properly basic, grounded in private reasons. But if that response is valid, then why can't we make the same move of defending the veridicality of our perceptions of value concerning any evil E? So I take it you get kind of the parallel I'm going for here.
Yeah. So again, there will be that that will be a contentious premise for the reasons you mentioned about the direct realists. Whereas I don't think that's going to hold in the skeptical theist case. But this is really interesting. I guess one thought is that I think that we can have good reasons for trusting our perceptions about the external world, although they're going to be circular. I think that, like William Alston has this book called The Reliability of Sense Perception, where he argues that, there are no non-circular arguments for thinking that there's an external world or trusting the reliability of sense perception. And that other philosophers like Mike Bergman and Andrew Moon have, I think, shown that there are certain kinds of circular reasoning that aren't bad. There's malign circular reasoning, but also benign. And in the case of the external world, I think that we can have these circular arguments that are benign. Whereas in the case of value judgments, that's not so clear to me, that you could have these circular arguments that aren't problematic. So that's where I think there's a relevant difference. But that's a really interesting objection that somebody should push on skeptical theism.
All right, it's on. I will expand this into a paper per our earlier conversation. Okay, so we'll put a pin in that for now. Then the third objection that you said was the strongest. Remind me what that was.
It's the equiprobability objection that's been defended by Richard Swinburne and Paul Draper. Do you want
that?
Oh, wait,
right.
Sorry.
Well, restate it for me. Restate it for me, and then what's your response?
I should have revisited this before I had this, but it goes. So I'm going to give a really rough outline, and I hope that I'm accurately stating it. But the thought is something like, okay, the skeptical theist says, well, we don't know there are these outweighing goods, or that there are these we don't know that there aren't any outweighing goods or unknown goods, and we don't know that there aren't any unknown God justifying reasons for evil. But also true is that we have no reason to think that there aren't these unknown evils connected to these evils that would swamp the unknown goods. And we don't know that there are these unknown reasons against God permitting some evil that would swamp the unknown reasons for God permitting the or allowing evil. And so the thought is like these unknown goods and unknown evils and these unknown reasons for permitting something and unknown reasons against permitting something are equiprobable. We have no reason to think one is more likely than the other. And then for some more technical reasons, if it's going to follow that skeptical theism doesn't really help because it's equiprobable that there's unknown goods and unknown evils connected. My response to that is something like this. First, I think that we need to be given a good reason to think they are equiprobable, and no one's really done that. And then second, I think that we have good reasons to think that the universe is biased towards permissibility, and it's biased towards goodness. But I'll focus on the permissibility because it's a little easier. And I think that the skeptical theism that matters is this deontological approach that focuses on God's reasons, because how God's probably going to act depends on his reasons. And one reason is axiological in terms of goodness and badness, but there are all sorts of other reasons God could have. And so when we want to predict how God's going to act, we need to look at reasons in general, not just one subset, which is goodness and badness. But okay, why should we think that the world is sort of biased towards permissibility and not impermissibility? Well, the general thought would be, well, I think 4 or 5 different reasons for thinking that. But one is like something like this, like, look, the default status of an action is permissible until you're given a reason for not doing it. So you might think that you have these autonomy-based reasons for doing what you want to do, a reason being something that counts in favor of an action. A reason against something would be that counts in favor of it being impermissible. And so given that, like, we can see that there's this sort of default status towards permissibility. Things are permissible, or rather, let me phrase it this way. Whether an action's impermissible is a function of the weight of the reasons for and against it. And if there's no reasons at all against it or for it, it's going to be permissible by definition here, because there's nothing weighting it towards being impermissible. So that's a reason where it starts out, where an action as default starts out as permissible. Second reason is going to be something like this. Like, look, moral dilemmas are impossible. A moral dilemma being one in which you are obligated to X and also not to X. So I've never read the book, but there's a book called Sophie's Choice, which a movie is based on. I've also never seen the movie. But if you're like cultured, you've probably read it or seen it. You probably read the book. And Sophie goes to this concentration camp, and she has to choose which child to send to the gas chambers. And the thought is that if you just look at her reason, she's going to have reasons, pretty decisive reasons against sending child A to the gas chambers. Like, it's your child, and it's just a person. You shouldn't send them to go be gassed. She'll also have the same reasons for child B, and it's going to weight towards impermissibility. But if Sophie has to choose one, or both will be sent. So it looks like these second-order reasons come into play, and it renders either choice permissible. And this will be the case for any apparent moral dilemma. And so it looks like we can't have moral dilemmas, which is a bias towards permissibility in the universe. So those are 2 reasons we have for thinking that there's a bias towards permissibility. How much of a bias? I don't know. But to break these equiprobability objections, you just need to show that they're not equiprobable, which is to just show that one is more likely than the other. And so if we have a bias towards permissibility, however much it is, whether it's a lot or a little, it's going to mean that we can't use these equiprobability principles that like Michael Tooley and Richard Swinburne and Paul Draper use. And so this equiprobability objection can't get off the ground.
Right. Okay. So here's a rough and ready response that they might give, that I'll give on their behalf. That I take it the logic here is roughly that there are 3 ways that the reasons could work out for and against the permissibility of some event. some instance of evil. Either the reasons against outweigh the reasons for, in which case it's impermissible. Or a second alternative is that the reasons for and the reasons against match. They just tie, and they are equally weighted, and so it's permissible. And the third is that the reasons for outweigh the reasons against, and so then it's permissible. So there are two ways for some event to be permissible. There's only one way for it to be impermissible. And that means they're not equiprobable. So far, so good?
That's a third argument I give. But yeah, that's
okay.
That's distinct from these two, but that is an argument I give. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then, I mean, perhaps a naive application of a principle of indifference would say, well, then, all right, there's a 1/3 chance for any evil that one of these three alternatives is realized concerning the unknown reasons. If that's the case, then when you stack up all the evils, the probability that there's at least one that is impermissible, that such that the reasons behind it render it impermissible, is going to be close to 1. I mean, for any specific evil, it's the odds are 2/3 that it's permissible. But then the odds that all of them are permissible will be 2/3 times 2/3 times 2/3 times 2/3. Eventually, obviously, you're going to get a minute probability that there are no impermissible events if all we're doing is applying a principle of so in other words, my response would be to amend their argument and just say we don't actually need equiprobability. We're good with this 1/3 probability.
Yeah. Let's pause so I can move downstairs real quick.
Okay.
Who do you think would win in a race, a pie cost or a dog?
What's the first one?
A pie cost.
What does a pie cost?
I don't know, like $6.
Oh.
Okay, so you wanted to reframe this objection as something like, oops, there. Oh, shoot. Well, that's fine. So you want to rephrase the objection in this way where we have these three options the world could turn out. And I guess my reply to that is something like this, like, well, we can't even really give those three options because that's going to depend on how likely it is there are these unknown reasons in the first place, unknown reasons for them being impermissible and unknown reasons for them being permissible. And so I interact a lot with Michael Tooley's equiprobability stuff here, but I say something like, well, we can't really say they're equiprobable, and so we can't assign these equal probabilities here because the nature of reasons in favor of the permissibility of something are radically different than the nature of reasons for thinking something is impermissible. So we have no good reason to assign those three options as equiprobable in the first place. And so, in fact, we probably just shouldn't, and we should weight them somehow towards the permissibility favoring ones being more likely. We don't know how much, but for that reason, we can't assign each of them having the same probability of 1/3. And so that's not going to work.
Yeah, I think it's worth thinking about more. That was just the reply that came to my mind.
And that's a clever way to rephrase it.
Well, there you go. That's what you'll get from me. So keep coming back. So the final objection that I want to get your take on, which you didn't raise, but is one of the most troubling ones to me that I think is under-addressed by skeptical theists, is, let's see if I get their name right, Kirkgianani's objection. That's their dual last name. If you know their paper, the radical insensitivity objection to skeptical theism. So I've made some mileage out of it in a paper under review on a different topic. The idea is that any evil, any possible evil, no matter how horrific, extensive, extravagant, or all-encompassing to our reality, skeptical theism seems to imply that we could never, ever say that we have now encountered some evidence against God's existence. It seems that there's no limiting principle upon the axiological or deontological skepticism that this viewpoint underwrites, such that even if, for example, to give William Rowe's thought experiment, even if the entirety of human life were nothing but suffering from birth till death for every single human being, skeptical theism and its underlying principles seem to imply that even then we couldn't say that we now have some evidence against God's existence. But that seems to be the wrong conclusion. So that skeptical theism goes wrong somewhere. Even if we can't tell where, it just seems radically insensitive to all possible evils, not even just the actual evils, but any possible evil, no matter its magnitude. And that seems wrong. So what would be your take?
Yeah, I don't really think that. I don't like that objection. I think that's my take. That's all. No, Brian, I can't remember his name. I feel like it's like Brian Davis. He just had a debate book with Mike Humer about whether we can know anything. Maybe it's not Brian Davis. Maybe it's Brian Francis. Maybe it's Brian Francis. So he has a paper in religious studies that puts this objection in a little bit more powerful a way. So he's a powerful way. So it goes something like, suppose you go on this cosmic trip, and you are familiar with all the goods and evils on Earth. You go, you find this other planet that's just like all the you see humans that are just in this horrible state, like in the worst country in the world right now, where there's the most suffering. Everyone's like that. Then you know that it's been like that for thousands of years. Then you travel to another planet, and it's like everyone's living in a Holocaust, and it's been like that for millions of years. And you go to another planet, and you find that it's full of people who have been in like a Holocaust squared for like eternity. Or not eternity, but a really long time. So you just go on this cosmic trip, you find more and more evil, more and more outrageous amounts, and the skeptical theist says, well, it's not evidence against theism. And that's, so I think that's the same objection that Kirk is saying, but I think his little story he has illustrates it in a pretty powerful way. So I guess there are 2 points. So one is something that Hudson raises somewhere. He says, like, well, yeah, if that's all there were and nothing more, we're stipulating that there are no reasons or something like that. There are no reasons that would justify God. Then sure, that's going to be good evidence against theism, or good evidence that this evil is unjustified or something like that. That's fine, but in that case, it's less interesting. But we can amend the example and we can say, well, it's not that there aren't any reasons. It's just that we don't know of any. And then I think that the skeptical theist has the right result in this sense. So the skeptical theist isn't saying, the thought isn't that evil can't be evidence against theism. The thought is that these certain kinds of inferences or arguments don't work to show that it's evidence against theism. So you could, just because we have no good reason to think that the perceived weight of God's reasons resembles the actual weight, or for Bergman, we have no good reason to think that the goods and evils we know of are representative of the goods and evils there are and their connections with each other and so on. That prevents certain kinds of inferences from being made and certain kinds of arguments. But that doesn't tell us that there can't be other arguments that don't succumb to skeptical theism that can be offered. So that's just to say that our current arguments might suck, and they would still suck even if we discovered a lot more evil. But just construct better arguments. You might think that, think about it this way. Like, so if we accept that the basic, I might be speaking too often. Nope, I'm in the clear. We might think that so if you the general thesis, again, it's gonna this is gonna be a rough and ready version, is like the skeptical theist says, if the fact that we don't recognize some instance of evil, recognize some reason that would justify God in allowing it, isn't good reason to think there is no reason. So they're rejecting this kind of no-seem inference. We see the reason, so therefore probably there is no such one. So think about it. If you were on a skyscraper and you're looking down into a garden, you don't see any ants in the garden, and so you say there probably are none. That'd be a bad argument. But now, to get this into a line with the argument that you were considering from Kirk and from Brian Francis, probably, maybe Brian Davis, would be something like this. It's a Brian of some sort. So would be like this. Like, suppose you're on the skyscraper and you can see a million gardens. And you say, okay, this one, I don't see an ant. Probably there's none. That's bad inference. This one, I don't see an ant. Therefore, probably there's none. That's also bad inference. That's still going to apply to every single garden that you see. So here's what here's what you might think, though. What the person should do is construct a skeptical theism friendly argument, in the sense that it doesn't conflict with skeptical theism. What they should do is they should say, look at all these instances of evil. Probably at least one is unjustified. And they could do that based on this preface paradox reasoning, which has been given by Luis Oliveira He's got this paper called the Paradox of Evil, where he just uses the preface paradox to sort of give this kind of argument that I outlined there. That is, at least at the initial stage, going to be immune to skeptical theism, and it could give you some evidence against theism. I don't think the argument works, but that's the way to go. And what that shows is that it's false that skeptical theism entails you can't have evidence against theism no matter the amount of evil. I think the argument doesn't work, but at the very least, that claim is wrong that's being made. And I have a paper which maybe it'll see the light of day someday where I tried to show this, but maybe it won't. We'll see.
So let me ask you then, if you were on this hypothetical spaceship going from increasingly horrific planet to increasingly horrific planet, one after another, do you think such would be evidence against theism? Whatever the logic, do you think that encountering those things, you would now have some evidence for atheism or naturalism, whatever?
So the traditional arguments, the best arguments from evil, like Draper's and Tooley's, I still think are going to fail. Rowe's argument, I don't think. Okay, you went out, but you're back. So I think that Draper's and Tooley's argument are still going to fail, and those are the best of the bunch by far. I think that Rowe's argument is still obviously going to fail. But I guess the answer is, yeah, I don't think it's going to be evidence because I don't think that the preface paradox is going to work in this case. And so, yeah, I guess all of the arguments I know, none of them are going to work even on that, even on if I go on that horrifying cosmic trip, all of those arguments are still going to fail. So I guess I think no, the answer is no.
Okay. Well, it underlines the point that for any potential reductio ad absurdum, like you can just accept the conclusion. But I still would think that something has gone wrong somewhere.
I don't think that's a reductio of skeptical theism or even a candidate for being one because it doesn't follow that skeptical theism just doesn't have that entailment. You have to, because like I said, there are these other arguments you can raise. So skeptical theism eliminates certain methods. And so all the arguments that rely on these methods are going to fail. But it's not to say that it results that skeptical theism has this clear implication that evil is an evidence against theism. Just says none of the current arguments.
Okay. Right. Okay. So there are two ways to look at it then. One would be to see this thought experiment as severing the connection between skeptical theism and the non-evidential significance of evil. Right. And that's what you're saying is that it's just meant to undermine variously proposed arguments from evil, but that's not to say that it establishes the positive conclusion that evil is not evidence for God's non-existence. Well, that's fine. I mean, I could raise several issues that might arise here, but then the more interesting question is, if you say you just admitted, yes, in this hypothetical situation, we would have evidence for atheism, even though I can't spell it out in an argument, and it would be up to the objector to show that that argument applies here. Still, it would seem to open the door to more directly applicable arguments from evil. Like once we grant that given this planet of a billion holocausts that last for a billion years, that would be good evidence for God's non-existence. And reflecting upon it, we then do gain a strategy where we can then turn to the evils we actually experience, our single holocaust for a certain period of time, and we can see that it's evidence for God's non-existence. So that's just a promissory note, right? Like the naturalist would have to spell it out. But I wonder if you begin to weaken the case for skeptical theism's significance in undermining the problem of evil if we admit that there is this hypothetical evidence. Maybe.
I don't really see that. Like to say that it's possible that someone could come up with an argument that works, that doesn't weaken the significance because skeptical theism is just a fact about human cognitive limitations, and it undermines various, all the most popular arguments from evil. So I think that's significant. And I mean, it's also true, and truth is significant. But you might, I mean, yeah, I guess I don't see that as weakening the significance because it applies to all the arguments we are considering. But yeah, it's possible someone could come up with an argument that it doesn't apply to. And there are arguments that skeptical theism doesn't apply to, like Paul Draper's low priors argument for atheism. We already know there are arguments that skeptical theism doesn't apply to. So that's not news, right?
Okay. All right. All right. I'll have to put more thought into it. I like the objection, so I'll continue to work with it. If you could send me a link of the bibliographic info for the Brian, whatever his name is, paper, that would be helpful, because I would like to think about that more.
If you cite it, you should put parentheses, whatever his name is, 2024.
Whatever his name happens to be. It's not the main Brian. We know that. Right. Okay. So that's skeptical theism. If you still have a little bit of time, I thought we'd be remiss if we didn't discuss the interaction between natural theology, arguments for God's existence, and skeptical theism. Many people claim that skeptical theism undermines natural theology, because those arguments seem to rely in one form or another on the claim that some state of affairs is likely if God exists. God would likely create these states of affairs. It's unlikely if naturalism is true, if nature is all there is. And so then, because we encounter these states of affairs, that fact is evidence for theism. But the crucial point of overlap between that kind of reasoning and skeptical theism is that proponents of these arguments claim that God is likely to bring about this state of affairs, whether that be a fine-tuned universe, orderly, natural laws, miracles, whatever. God's likely to do that because it would be good for God to do so. These are good states of affairs. But then that brings the argument into collision with skeptical theism, which claims, well, we can't know that the actual value of these states of affairs resembles the perceived value. And so it seems that skeptical theism undermines the inferences involved in natural theology. Do you accept that?
I don't want to be remiss, so I better talk about this.
Yeah, exactly. We wouldn't want to do that.
So yeah, let's see. So I mean, the short answer is that I think that the traditional way that a lot of arguments from natural theology are stated do conflict with skeptical theism, and skeptical theists have acknowledged this, like Mike Bergman. I think that's right, but I think there are. That just means that one method for using them doesn't work. I think that there is a method that might be applicable, that might make it so you can do some natural theology and be a skeptical theist. And it also, this route of doing natural theology opens up a route for doing natural atheology. So the suggestion that I'm going to make, that you can sort of run arguments for theism, is also going to be a way that you could run arguments for atheism. My view is that on this route, it's much easier to make arguments for theism than atheism. But it's still a route that I think atheists pursue, because it's your best hope for. It's a route anyone should pursue, because you should be interested in evidence no matter who you are. So atheists and theists should be looking at this. But okay, the thought would be something like this. So what skeptical theism is undermining are these inferences and these premises based on the perceived weight of God's reasons. But here's a way you might run arguments instead. So the fine-tuning argument is going to cite the various goods about humans and rational creatures that come about, and so God's going to want to do good things. So it's not crazy unlikely that God would create, that he would fine-tune the laws, or fine-tune the world in such a way that we would come about. Whereas given atheism, it's really unlikely without this external bias that we would come to be. So the problem here is, how do we ascribe a probability of judgment to fine-tuning or rational creatures or consciousness given theism? There's no problem with ascribing the probability given atheism. Well, that's controversial, but at least in this debate, it's not controversial. And so I say something like this. You might think that an alternative route would be sort of thinking that if we think that if God exists, God is the greatest possible being, and if we also assume that God is going to create one of the best possible, a world among the set of best possible worlds, we have those two assumptions, which, as far as I can tell, are skeptical theism friendly in the sense that they don't conflict with it. One route to predicting what kind of world we'd find ourselves in if theism were true would be to think that God would create worlds that resemble him more in important respects than in other well, let me put it this way. So God would create worlds that resemble him in important respects. Why is that? Well, because he's the greatest possible being, so the greatest possible worlds are going to be ones that resemble him in some way. And so you might think, well, probably one of the most fundamental and best ways to resemble God would be to be a conscious agent in some way. And if that's true, then we could think that conscious agency at least has a relatively high, or at least not crazy low, probability given theism. And so we could run an argument. We could ascribe a decent probability to it given theism, based on that kind of reasoning, which arguably isn't vulnerable or susceptible to criticisms stemming from skeptical theism. And since the issue of ascribing the probability of conscious agency given atheism was never up in the air or never vulnerable to skeptical theism, it looks like we can still run the argument, because we can say that it's not crazy unlikely that we'd have conscious agency if theism is true, for those reasons I gave, but it is crazy unlikely to have conscious agency if atheism is true. So we have evidence for theism. And you can run this on a couple of arguments, like the psychophysical harmony argument, and maybe like the moral knowledge argument and a few others. And again, as I said before, you can try to run this in favor of atheism as well and construct some arguments for atheism based on that. But I know that you don't find that move convincing. So maybe you can show me why that's wrong. And to be from the outset, let me say, and I've been talking forever, and this is really annoying to hear myself speak this much, but what was I going to say? Oh yeah, I was going to say this part of my book is the part that I have the least amount of confidence in. But that doesn't tell you anything necessarily, because I might have 100% confidence in the rest of the book.
Right, and this is 89 or something.
Yeah. But yeah, let's hear why you don't like that move.
Well, I want it to succeed, right? This is friendly fire at some level, but I just think that it would then be all too easy to. So let's grant your point that that reformulated version of the fine-tuning argument, or in general the natural theological argument, is consistent with skeptical theism. Like, just give you that. It seems relatively easy to then refashion arguments from evil for atheism along similar lines, that these instances of evil all fail to resemble God in crucial ways, or the greatest conceivable being, and therefore they are to that degree unlikely, given theism. So it's just not clear to me how to break the parallel.
So I guess the first thing is, I'd say that's not an objection to the view. That's just like, okay, we can I don't think that shows that the view is false. It's just like, hey, the case for atheism is more optimistic than Perry says. I think that's the way to put it. So not a problem for the view. My second and bigger concern is I just don't see that. I think I try to construct one argument for atheism given this method in that chapter, and it just is a lot more contentious than I think the argument that I laid out there. And so that's why, because you might, well, yeah, let's leave it at that. Like, I think that it's a lot more contentious to show that some fact about evil doesn't resemble God and is therefore unlikely, because you might think that there are other facts that make that resemble God that make it not crazy unlikely that you'd have evil or something like that.
Okay. Well, I want to honor your time commitments. You still have to go and grade papers, which sounds terrible. But I think the discussion here has given me a lot to think about, because skeptical theism isn't the main area of expertise that I've begun to develop. But I think it's fascinating, and I want it to succeed. But my worry will still be these issues of overgeneralization, that it issues in too much skepticism, that it reduces to absurdity, potentially in the case of extreme evils. And so I'm not sure, but you've given me a lot to think about.
Well, I have good news for you. You want it to succeed, and I can tell you it does, and it's correct. So,
oh, perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Perry. This has been a fascinating conversation. I hope people find it helpful for understanding these complicated issues, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, should I say something like, cool, it's been nice to be here.
Oh, great. Cool. Thanks. I like that ending.